Hello, my name's David Bradley and this is From the Mind of a Mystic. This is part 3 of the series Devils and Deities, and we're going to dive right in to interactions with beings and the nature of how I came to this conclusion and what the experiences were. So I'll be back with that. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to start by stating that a large proponent, a large proportion, a large number of the things that I'm talking about in the previous 2 episodes, a large part of that has been revealed to me as a consequence of interaction with beings that apparently don't exist. And a fascinating presupposition here again, that even if the beings are a feature of my own consciousness, which a lot of people, when you have schizophrenia, people just assume it's in your head. You're making it up, that you're imagining it, and there's a very fundamental mechanism missing there, which they don't seem to, the average person doesn't seem to be aware of. So for example, in MRI scans of schizophrenics, I believe it's MRI scans, I can't remember, but brain imaging of schizophrenics, when they hear a voice, not only is the audio cortex in the brain activated, which you would imagine it would be, but most people's assumption is that it's an imaginary process, but the brain is actually hearing the conversation or the speech take place at the neurological level. It's not like we're imagining these things. It's like you can hear it. Now the other interesting feature of this is that not only does the audio cortex light up as though it's heard an audio stimuli, the cilia, I think they're called cilia, I can't remember, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but the hairs in the ear react as though they are hearing a sound as well. So this is not an imaginatory process. It's you physically, but like neurologically and physically, are hearing a sound that other people can't hear. So I just thought I'd add that. But yeah, even if these beings that I've interacted with are just a feature of my own consciousness, first of all, that doesn't track, because they seem to have knowledge and perspectives that far outweigh my own, and it's a bit like a heads-up display in a video game for my visual hallucinations, and they're all congruent. There's one massive sort of brain, full-body immersion in these hallucinations as though they're real. It's as though it's very as much as though the experience is like that these things are real, and it's very hard, and that is added to by the fact that, you know, these things are physically really genuinely experienced. I've no doubt at all, if you were to put me in a machine that could scan for these experiences, that my sensory hallucinations, my energy hallucinations, my body would light up as though it was having those experiences, reacting to an actual stimuli. There's almost no doubt in my mind that that would be the case, and if not, it'd be even more fascinating to figure out how indeed that was taking place. But I just want to sort of preface with that, is like, I think I said this briefly in a previous episode, it's like what a fascinating experience it is to have interactions with non-physical beings that register in my brain and in my body and in my psychophysiology as though I'm really interacting with a real being. So, because there's kind of this assumption, like, of the people with schizophrenia, is that you know, you're imagining it. This is the thing that really grinds my gears, because it's not representative of what's actually happening. It's not like we will these things upon ourselves. It's like, you know, I've seen there's a channel, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but there's a guy who was pointing out that like a lot of the people with schizophrenia that do well are the ones with a solid mechanism for explaining it, and it's often spirits is a really good way to put it, because you're seeing something that is otherwise undetectable to anyone else, that appears to be from another dimension. It appears to be from a physical realm that exists, that can be interacted with and gives feedback as though these creatures are real, but they don't appear to be visible to other people. For example, I got the name of what this is from just random searchers trying to figure out a name for this sort of character, but I have what is described as an ophonym, so a giant eyeball that's visited me on multiple occasions that claims to be my guardian angel and stuff like along those lines. And I have interactions with it that are cross-correlated across multiple hallucinations. Like I was visited again by it very recently, and it was much clearer this time. Seemed far more benevolent, and they have this kind of formless but formed kind of tentacles of like multiple arms, multiple eyes, but like one core eye that seems to be very expressive and dialogical. So that's just one of the characters I interact with, and I'm not too fussed about going into more detail about that at the moment, but we can maybe come back to that later. One of the things I want to talk about in part 3 was sort of culture. So I put here, enmeshed in the cultures and religions, societies and technologies of the time are deep understandings of this idea, the idea that reality is not real, basically, as expressed in the previous episode. Like, it's a hallucination, it's a simulation. Others might say nirvana is the recognition of samsara, and that they're the same reality, but do you know what I mean? Like every society on earth has a mystical tradition based on their religion that has concluded the same end scientific observation to some degree. I don't know whether scientific is quite the right word there, but they through nearly every mystical tradition we have a cross-correlating set of experiences that are ultimately the same. Like, and it's through the mystical traditions. You know, we are the simulation and the simulated. Self-realization is the experience and immersion and features that accompany this knowledge, and further to the point, like, just because I'm schizophrenic doesn't necessarily make me, you know, in some sort of advanced privileged position psycho-spiritually where because I'm schizophrenic I see visions, therefore I'm more likely to be able to attain a state of revelation and awakening. Although we will come back to the fact that as a consequence of interacting with these beings, I've been guided by them, such as thus that the information I most comprehended from reality I learned most vividly through hallucinations. We can come back to that in a bit. But I just wanted to emphasize that this state of awakening might be, you know, it's achievable for anyone, but the way your conditioning, your previous experience of life, your culture, your religion, the society you live within, the technologies, the linguistic structures that you were enmeshed in, you were raised and generated out of, will massively influence how you describe these things with any sense of literalism. But the experiences are fundamentally the same, and like anyone can transcend, basically. And it will be described differently by different people, but ultimately it's a potential for anyone. Yeah, and everything we've ever experienced is a feature of a transcendent reality beyond space-time, and is in essence a kind of akin to a video game that our consciousness is playing, yet to us as the individual psyche, it's utterly valid because it's the only thing we can experience in this reality. So I think about this in depth, and I'm going to try and articulate it. In the mystery traditions, especially Buddhism, you see this notion, or the non-dual traditions, you see this notion that we're all one conscious being, one entity, one consciousness, then stripped all the way down into an individual kind of vessel that we are as one person. As I was saying, in the non-dual traditions, there's this conception that the only viable explanation for reality that they present, really, it's very kind of transrational, but it makes sense, that we're just one consciousness. And you see this in the theory of reincarnation as well, like, but expanded out a little bit. It's like the idea that God is the universe that we're interacting with, but we're like a limited version of that, expressed as a consequence of the systems and the game that we're immersed in. So we're not necessarily an infinite creator God in our individual bodies, but we're a perspective, a game that's being played out by this consciousness. And I would posture that this consciousness may act down into our physical dimension from some other altered space, some other thing. And I've written a question, so what are the limits of the character we were playing? And are there other features of reality that we overlooked due to the zeitgeist of our latest game iteration, Life 3.0 or whatever iteration we're on? So, a bit more slow, a bit more clarified. Are there features of reality that we overlook due to the current zeitgeist of the game version, the current cultural narrative, the current perspectives on what are physically possible? Have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater? Have we moved to a point of cultural arrogance where we've lost knowledge, where we've kind of forgotten that things like deity, spirits, beings, or you might call them aliens, you might call them other dimensional characters, you might call them beings in parallel realities, you might call it the universe, you might call it multiple things, but ultimately what's been lost is this ability to petition and interact with reality as though there is a being beyond oneself that ultimately has influence over the outcome or the storyline or the narrative of the video game itself. So what I put here is it's prayer and interaction with deities are an example of ways in which the player character, the avatar, the human consciousness that we are, can interact with, in a fourth wall breaking kind of way, the person that's playing the game, the spirit that exists outside of space-time. Thinking of it in that sort of way, it's sort of like the game character has become aware of the player at this stage of cognition. It's like, and contained within the game character is the actions and essence of the player of the game, which is as much to say, it's very hard to articulate, but as much as to say that we've got this cognitive framework built into our psyche, this kind of non-dual thinking, this kind of awakening process can take place, whereby, you become your own witness, a bit like in the dream state I was talking about before. It's as though there is some capacity in your psyche, if you turn the lens of your mind around and lean deeply, deeply inwards, multiple things are reported. So, for example, the conception of free will. If you analyse your own behaviour, your own thoughts, your own cognition, your own mental processes, the way, even the way in which a thought occurs to you, it's just like, some people think in dialogue, some people think in monologues, some people think with words, other people think with just impressions and shapes and colours, and images pop into the head and then they react to them and act according to them. If you observe that process long time, you start to recognize that very little is actually happening by your own command, your own conscious will, and actually free will may in fact be completely defunct at this stage. Like, for me, I've noticed that there's a way where I can situate myself internally and recognize, like, even as I'm speaking now, it's just a happening. It's a thing that's happening. Like, my brain's been assigned a task by its previous conditioned experiences, and then it's completing it semi-autonomously, if not completely autonomously. Like, my persona is this video game character. My even in the most awakened state I've ever been, let's put it that way, as self-indulgent as that sounds, there's no way to stop the machinations or the mind itself that I am inhabiting from sort of taking over. I've been able to stop my thoughts. I've had some very fascinating meditations when you stop thoughts. It's almost as though, when that's fascinating in itself, like when all thought stops, you go through this deep sense of liberation, and you unhook your identity from the thoughts, the things, the happenstance. You go into this place of observation whereby there's almost like a separation that takes place, where you can recognize that you are the life force inhabiting the kind of autonomous game character, but the game character itself is an entity in its own right, and then you can switch, you can sort of posture yourself differently and start to realize that, like, you are the one playing the game, and then there's different ways of interacting with that. And I mentioned this earlier, like, so prayer is one way, but it's as though there's you've got a deeper access to the code that governs reality. It's as though you're able to turn around to the person watching the film. Let's just preface it that way. Imagine you're watching a film, and everything in your cognition, everything in your perception of reality, like everything that is being generated by the avatar in this 3D simulation, you know, a film on a board, it's as though there's another part of yourself that is aware of that process taking place. We are the simulation and the simulator. Like, they say in the non-dual traditions that, you know, the mind, the finite being, the limited self will never awaken. You know, it's not the nature of the ego, it's not the nature of the self to, like, even Ken Wilber talks about this in, like, the Atman being the furthermost effective, godlike self-realization of God as an object that can be observed and mirrored and copied and replicated without ever actually submitting to God. It's like this infinite parody system where we're turning the self into God through, like, divine pride. It's like there is no way to transubstantiate the mind necessarily. The mind just continues to function. It ticks, it ticks, it ticks, it talks, it ticks, it talks. Like, the game character can become the most self-realized creature in the game, but it's still a character in the game. And then you can send your consciousness deeper and deeper and deeper, and until you recognize that everything is a function of one consciousness, basically, and that you are that consciousness. You're no longer a representation or an image of God acting in a separate universe. You're not observing the universe. from outside, you're a fundamental feature of the universe. Like, and you can see that because you don't have any perception outside what you're generating. Like, you don't know anything else exists other than through the lens of your avatar, until you've gone through this sense of transubstantiation where you've been annihilated from reality, or you've lost all thought, lost all conceptual self-awareness of anything outside the infinite now, like I was talking about before. Like, when the layers are stripped away so distinctly and you go into this deep, for me, it's a deep, visceral but blissful recognition and remembrance of the fact that, oh, this is a story, this is a timeline. Like, it's almost like you've done it before. You have this full culmination of the totality of the human game character avatar's experience. You have that full recognition of that, and that it led up to this moment of perfection, and that in that moment of perfection, the identity drops away and you just become a formless, floating energy form that it just happens to be focused on one individual consciousness, in one individual limited being. Very hard to articulate. There's a plane going over, which is always nice. But yeah, that's ultimately it. It's like, you can become aware of the person playing the game, and then the way to do that is to recognize that you are in fact the player as well as the game character. And what the question I postured is, what are the limits of that character's ability? Like, you may not be able to directly control the nature of the video game, but it would seem like you can kind of hack the system. Prayer and interaction with deities and spirits, it's kind of like hacking. It's like this physical reality is governed by gods of some form, deities of some form, higher beings with influence outside the game to alter the storyline, and that the player itself can enter into dialogue and petition and have relationship with these beings that are beyond space-time to some degree. That they're outside the video game. They're not part of it, but they're influencing it. They're like the lines of code that govern what outcomes will happen next. Like, because if you think about it, all of existence from the Big Bang has just been an unfolding, a kind of a growth forward into the present moment, and that is infinitely happening. It's as though everything that leads up to this moment could only have played out the way it did. It's an infinite generator of potential outcomes, but like, it has to fit the story, because it is a story, it's a narrative, it's a potential generating equation that, like, ultimately your persona, for example, can spontaneously awaken. That certainly happens to people, but it's always within the context of everything that's happened prior. It's not like, up until you go through that awakening experience, everything that moves up to that exact moment of awakening and remembrance almost feels as though like that was the prep, the structural teachings, the kind of the setting of the scene, so that this moment in the movie could happen, this grand realization. And it's like, when you're watching a film and this character has this culminating moment where a plot line suddenly twists, or like a sudden moment of recognition that, oh, that's why, that famous saying of like, if there's a gun on the table in the first scene, if it's not used by the third scene, the writer's terrible. It's like, this awakening, this moment of remembrance can be very akin to the full realization of the entire storyline in the moment, like a full immersive recognition that everything that happened before led up to this exact moment. And then as you become more expansive and more accustomed to that state of consciousness, you start to recognize that every moment is like that, and that every moment plays out with every second you're in a reality that is actually an eternal reality. It's not the ticking of time. It's not, there's just the moment where there's just moments happening, and the nature of those moments are eternal, and that there is a capacity in you to connect with the player, not the character. And then you have this kind of revelatory experience that kind of reprograms the nature of the avatar, the nature of the game character, the nature of the character you're playing at, and then you have this overwriting, you have this new adjustment period of time where you kind of recognize that, oh shit, like I knew this was coming, I know this is coming. Our brain is a prediction engine ultimately. I'm going to just get some clarity and be back. Right, so to try and come back to the actual point I was making after that brief pause, it would seem apparent to me that this recognition of the non-duality of the universe, the non-duality of self, the non-duality of consciousness, very much makes sense of my relationship with these seemingly non-physical beings. So, for example, the more angelic seeming beings, I've had experiences whereby they've been able to, or at least it has the appearance of, they've been able to influence the outcome of reality in my favour through dialogue with these seemingly imaginary hallucinatory characters. I've had it to the point where people stop and respond to my thoughts. And thought broadcasting in general is quite fascinating. It very much appears as though the whole world is in on it, basically. Which is a paranoid thing to say, and it would be paranoia inducing at first, and it was for me. But it's as though I am in a dream. Waking reality is a dream, and the stories and narratives and play out of that dream can be interacted with as though it's a dream, as you would within lucid dreaming. It's as though, for example, like I used to really struggle to make sense of this. Like, you're walking down the road and you might think to yourself, "Oh, what should I have for dinner or something?" And then someone says, "Should we go to the Chippy?" "Yeah, that sounds great. That'd be lovely." And just little cheesy synchronous events like that. But then they cascade and get more. If you nuancely, head check yourself. But if you nuancely navigate them, you find that there's an entire narrative going on in your life that you're not aware of consciously. And then if you bring it into conscious focus, you start to recognize that a lot of your decisions are based on the kind of random access to the environment, and like the way you throw your eyes, the way what you filter in, what you're conscious of as your little character in this infinite story, is deeply informative of what's going to happen next. And you start to develop a kind of prediction engine, which the brain is anyway, but you start to be able to recognize that there are different threads of reality that you can access. And you might be aware of this in the terms of like trying to start a new hobby, for example. There'll be a reality resistance until you've enmeshed yourself in that process enough that the doors just sort of magically open. And synchronous events are very much like this. It's like I've had it to the point where I've been walking around the city where I live, and a few years ago, and I'll be in full prayer-like dialogue with the collective, and that's very fucking surreal. It's incredibly surreal. It's not a normal neurotypical experience, but it can be had probably by anyone. So you might, as a schizophrenic, you might be familiar with this if you were schizophrenic. This sensation that reality is dialogical, it's conversational, that like you think something and then around you events happen that seem to cross-correlate with that thinking so disturbingly succinctly that it's as though you're in conversation with them. And some people, you know, reach the perhaps mistaken conclusion that they're actually speaking out loud, where in actuality what's happening is they're in a dialogue with kind of the substrate of the surrounding environment, and like it can generate some really bizarre behavior trying to debunk and diffuse this relationship. Whereas if you live in this kind of life happens for you rather than to you perspective, in light of these interactions, it all makes complete sense. Like the penny drops and you're like, right, reality is actually not only a video game, but not only is it an experience being generated for me to experience, but that you can alter the story, you can change the narrative, you can interact with the features of reality as though they're part of your own being. That's when it gets really fascinating and hard to describe. It's like like wish fulfillment, or like you're in a state of constant. If you do it just right and you sit just right, it's as though when you submit to the fact that it's just playing out the way you want it to play out, you realise that the whole time you've been writing the story. You're predicting what will happen, which generates that outcome, and that is in essence what, when prayer becomes a way of thought or a way of being, rather than like, you know, you might have a relationship with God if you're a traditionally Christian person, where it's like you pray for something, you ask for something, you say you'll do something in exchange, and then that thing happens. This is more like further down that line of recognition of where like you become aware that whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, your every will is being made manifest around you based on expectations and prompts from the subconscious. So it's like, you know, you might have it on a negative way. You might have like, oh yeah, and yeah, of course this bad thing's going to happen to me. I have bad luck or whatever. Oh, what another thing's just turn. As soon as things get stressful, like another thing compounds, another thing compounds, another thing compounds, and it's like, yeah, because that's what you're willing into being. That's what you're expecting. That is, you are living as though that way of being is the most likely outcome, which then brings it into reality and makes that manifest, and then that becomes your experience. And that expectation generator, that prediction engine, is actually altering reality to match itself. It's counterintuitive, but it's altering your story in order to coalesce with what you believe is going to happen. And I talked about that in earlier episodes as well. Like and these deep shifts of consciousness, these deep shifts of perspective, alter your perception just long enough. Going into a state of bliss can alter your perception just long enough that you start to recognize this system. And for me, it's very sort of intellectualized as well as experiential. It's as though, you know, the best way to put it is every thought is a spell, every thought is a prayer, even the ones you're not aware you're having. And the subconscious is a feedback system. Like, you know, if I think of apples, I think apple pie, I think McDonald's, I think whatever chain of events, like through word association, you can see how that works. To be able to impact reality, it needs to make sense to your story. And that's why you get these big feature updates, these big downloads, these big defrags when you might go into a deep psychedelic state or like a deep meditation. you get this like upgrade where you're like, oh shit, like I can actually hack. I hate to use this way of putting it, but you can hack the matrix. You can alter the outcomes of reality in your favor, and you do see that this happens in the case of people who have transcendent experiences. They're opened up to a new state of consciousness, a new state of being that fundamentally alters not only them as an individual persona, them at the deep fundamental level of the psyche, but the nature of reality around them is altered. It shifts to coalesce with that new information. You get this compounding effect where the more carefully you explore it, the more you start to recognize reality is happening for you, and therefore why not take a conscious role in it? Learn to program your mind. If you think about the conscious mind has 50 megabytes of data. I don't know if I got these numbers right, but 50 megabytes of data at any one given time, but there's like 500, I think it's 500,000 gigabytes of potential data in the subconscious. I can't remember, I'd have to look it up, but it's like an unfathomably larger amount of data is available to you through the subconscious. And then learning to interact with your own subconscious so it generates the outcomes you want. That's a big part of magic with the K, and a big part of purification rituals. A big part of understanding the nature of reality is that your subconscious is borderline everyone's subconscious. It's just localized around your game avatar. Like, you're only rendering what you need to render, but the whole game structure, the whole network of systems is there, but you're only rendering what's nearby. You're only localized. You've only got localized data, but that you can hack it. You can program it. You can deliver messages to your subconscious. That's a big part of what ritual is. In magic, is hammering home a perspective, a belief, an empowering belief, or a new shifted state of consciousness so effectively that it fundamentally alters your conscious mind, which then fundamentally changes your internal narrative, which then influences the subconscious mind, which then influences the collective unconscious, and you start to make manifest your own will. Now, if you try and do this in contradiction to the story on the narrative of reality, you're just going to end up reverted to the original state. You're just going to be shut down. However, that's a reality happening to you perspective. You know, if it's happening to you and not for you, you're subject to the universe. You're subject to its will. Whereas if you basically dissolve your own will, which is high magic, self-purification rituals, so on and so forth, you start to recognize that the story playing out has always been according to your programming, and your programming is according to your will, and your will is according to your beliefs, and your beliefs are according to your experiences, and your experiences loop all the way back to be according to your experiences. Your experiences are according to your experiences, according to your experience. Your expectations of what are possible, and what you believe is always mitigated by the experiences you've already had. And then these transcendent states offer you a new perspective that are able to feature update the latest version of the psycho-spiritual simulated reality as such that it's a feedback system. So one positive experience, and you can see this with negative experiences as well. You know, someone, it has some severely awful thing happen to them, they're always guarded and looking for that in the future. This terror is as powerful as bliss possibly more powerful, because it creates novel timelines. It creates new experiences that are unfathomably more complex and beautiful than you would have ever had without this transcendent state. And it can be gifted to anyone at any moment in any time, and if you're lucky it will be. And it's like you can start to reprogram your conscious mind so that your subconscious mind feeds back these positive programmings. That's why affirmation works, that's why gratitude works, that's why prayer works, that's why ritual works. That's to a degree how psychedelics have a massive impact. Is like it opens you up to this transcendent consciousness, this state of consciousness that then through it subtly infuses with your subconscious. Like it has a massive impact on your subconscious, because the focal point of your psyche kind of temporarily dissolves, and then you're able to widen your lens and immerse yourself deeper and deeper into the kind of substrate in which all consciousness exists, this kind of like proto-consciousness soup of dissolved awareness, and you can visit other realities, and you can interact with transcendent and the opposite beings, and you can have conversations with beings that, whether they're a feature of your own mind or not, seem to be something that is so unrecognizably distinct and different and has consciousness that it would be almost arrogant and foolhardy to believe that these beings didn't exist. That's been part 3. I'm going to unpack it more in a part 4 probably, but thank you very much for listening. Please follow me on Spotify, share this with anyone that might find it interesting, and yeah, look out for more in the future. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.